You will not learn the history of your surname, because it was concealed in order to hide the traces of Tartaria. That sentence probably sounds like the kind of thing you scroll past, something you'd file under paranoia and forget by the time your coffee cools. I understand that impulse. I had it myself, for years, but I need you to stay with me, because what I found when I started tracing the administrative history of surnames, not their etymologies, not their folklore, but their bureaucratic origins, was something I wasn't prepared for. And I've been doing this long enough that I don't say that lightly. I wasn't researching names. I was researching buildings. That's always where it starts for me, with the architecture, with the stone, with the physical evidence that doesn't argue, doesn't negotiate, just sits there waiting to be measured. I was looking at municipal records halls in the American Midwest, structures from the 1870s and 1880s that I've discussed in previous episodes, buildings whose scale and engineering seem wildly disproportionate to the frontier towns they supposedly served. And in one of these buildings, in a county courthouse in central Ohio that officially opened in 1878, I found the vault. Not a metaphorical vault, a literal one. A fireproof records room in the basement, behind a door of solid iron, built into the original construction. The vault was designed, clearly and purposefully, to store civil documents, birth records, death records, property deeds, and surname registries. Enormous leather-bound ledgers, handwritten, cataloging every family name in the county, cross-referenced by property, by occupation, by what the clerks of the era called national origin. The earliest entries date to 1869, the latest to 1903, and then nothing. The books simply stop, mid-alphabet in some cases, as if someone walked away from the project or was told to stop. The county archivist was polite, helpful, and entirely uninterested in the question I was asking. "Those are just old census supplements," she said. "We have digitized records now," and that was that. But I sat with those ledgers for 3 hours, and what I saw in them was not a census supplement. It was a system for assigning, standardizing, and in many cases replacing the names that people carried when they arrived. Let me back up, because this requires context that most people have never been given reason to think about. We treat our surnames as ancient, as permanent, as something handed down through generations stretching back into the mist of time. The Smiths were always Smiths. The Millers always milled. The Johnsons were always the sons of John. It feels natural. It feels organic. It feels like something that simply happened. But it didn't simply happen. It was made to happen. And when you look at the timeline, at the specific decades when surname standardization was enforced across the industrialized world, you find a pattern so compressed and so coordinated that the standard explanations begin to feel not wrong exactly, but incomplete, deeply, structurally incomplete. In England, hereditary surnames became legally fixed through a series of administrative reforms stretching from the late medieval period through the 1800s. But the process wasn't smooth. It was contested, uneven, and in many regions, effectively incomplete until civil registration was imposed in 1837. Before that, names shifted. A man might be William the Cooper in one parish record, and William Harding in another, depending on who was writing and what seemed relevant at the time. The name was functional, descriptive, contextual. It belonged to the community, not to the state. In Scandinavia, the pattern is even more revealing. Patronymic naming, where your surname was simply your father's first name with son or daughter appended, persisted in Sweden until 1901, when a royal decree required all citizens to adopt a fixed hereditary surname. In Norway, the same transition was enforced in 1923. Think about that. Within living memory of people alive today, an entire nation's naming system was dismantled and replaced by government mandate. In the Ottoman Empire, surnames didn't exist in the modern sense until Ataturk's surname law of 1934, which required every Turkish citizen to adopt a fixed family name. Overnight, millions of people who had been known by patronymics, by tribal affiliations, by occupational descriptors, by regional identifiers, were compressed into a Western-style naming framework. The old names weren't just changed. In many cases, they were prohibited. Japan. The Meiji government's family registration system, the Koseki, formalized in 1871, required every household to register a permanent surname. Before that, the vast majority of the Japanese population, commoners, farmers, merchants, simply didn't use surnames. The practice had been restricted to the samurai class. And then, in the span of a single administrative act, everyone had one. Germany, Austria, the Habsburg reforms of the late 18th century imposed surname adoption on Jewish communities that had previously used patronymic or descriptive naming traditions. The names assigned were often arbitrary, sometimes deliberately humiliating, chosen by bureaucrats who held the power to determine how an entire people would be indexed by the state. I could continue. The Philippines, under Spanish colonial administration, where the Catalogo Alfabético de Apellidos, a book of approved surnames, was distributed to provincial governors in 1849 with instructions to assign names from its pages to every Filipino family, erasing indigenous naming conventions in a single administrative act. The document still exists. You can hold it in your hands. A physical book of replacement names, printed and distributed by a colonial government, used to overwrite the identity of an entire archipelago. Indigenous communities across the Americas whose naming practices were overwritten by mission records and reservation registries. The Navajo, the Lakota, the Cherokee, peoples with naming traditions that encoded clan relationships, seasonal knowledge, geographic belonging, all compressed into anglicized surnames by Bureau of Indian Affairs agents who wrote them into ledgers with the same casual administrative authority as the clerks in Ohio. Russia deserves particular attention because the timeline there is especially revealing. Before the reforms of Peter the Great in the early 1700s, the Russian peasantry largely used patronymic naming, fluid and contextual, much like Scandinavia. The imposition of fixed surnames came in waves, first for the nobility, then for the merchant class, then finally for the peasantry, with the process not fully completed until the mid-1800s. The same decades, the same window, and in Russia, more than anywhere else. The original names carried a vocabulary that I keep encountering. Names that reference stonework, hydraulic engineering, atmospheric observation, energy transfer. Terms that don't fit the agrarian economy these people supposedly inhabited. Terms that suggest a different world, a different infrastructure, a different civilization's organizational logic persisting in the names people carried. Like artifacts they didn't fully understand anymore, but hadn't yet been forced to surrender. The pattern is global, and it clusters, with remarkable consistency, in a specific window of history. Roughly from the mid-1700s through the early 1900s. The same window, I should note, in which the last references to Tartaria disappear from cartographic records. The same window in which the architectural anomalies I've documented throughout this series were either constructed or, as I've suggested, inherited and repurposed by the civilizations that now claim them. This raises a question I keep coming back to. Not the obvious conspiracy question, not who orchestrated this, because I don't think it's that simple. The question is structural. What does it mean to replace a naming system? What does a state gain when it standardizes the way human beings identify themselves? The practical answers are obvious. Taxation, conscription, property law, inheritance tracking, census accuracy. All the machinery of modern governance that requires individuals to be uniquely identifiable across time and space. You cannot tax someone whose name changes with every parish boundary they cross. You cannot draft someone into military service if you can't verify their age against a permanent record tied to a permanent name. You cannot build a modern bureaucratic state on a foundation of fluid, community-based contextual identity. But here's what the practical explanation doesn't account for. What was lost in the transition? What information did the older naming systems carry that the new ones erased? This is where I need to slow down, because this is the part that changed how I think about the entire subject. When I went back to those ledgers in Ohio, the ones in the basement vault, I noticed something in the original entries. The pre-standardized names. The names people carried before the clerks assigned them new ones. Many of them were not patronymic. They were not occupational, not in the way we understand the term. They were architectural, structural. They referenced building techniques, construction materials, infrastructure components, names that translate roughly to Keeper of the Arch, Warden of the Canal, Master of the Foundation, Guardian of the Resonance Chamber. Not in English, in a nomenclature that drew from multiple linguistic roots, Slavic, Germanic, Latinate, and something else entirely, something the ledger clerks clearly didn't recognize, because in the margins they wrote careful notes in pencil, notes that were never meant to be part of the formal record. Origin unclear, language unknown, no corresponding trade classification available. And then, in a different hand, sometimes in red ink, the directive, assigned replacement per county administrative order. I sat with one particular entry for a long time. A family of 7, registered in 1871. The original surname, transcribed phonetically by a clerk who was clearly guessing at the spelling, contained a root that appears across Slavic, Turkic, and Sanskrit naming traditions. It referenced, as near as I could determine, something related to the maintenance of underground water systems. Not wells, not pumps. Something more complex. Something the clerk had no vocabulary for. The replacement name assigned was Waters, simple, clean, English, and utterly empty of the specific technical meaning the original carried. Assigned replacement. Not translated. Not anglicized. Replaced. The original name deemed unclassifiable and overwritten with something the system could process. Smith, Miller, Cooper, Johnson. Names that sound ancient to us but were, in many documented cases, administrative assignments given to people whose actual names referenced a world the administrators either didn't understand or weren't supposed to acknowledge. And once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. I started looking at surname registries in other regions, not the digitized, sanitized databases we use today, but the original handwritten ledgers, the ones kept in courthouse basements and parish archives and the back rooms of historical societies that haven't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. In St. Louis, I found similar patterns. Pre-standardized names referencing hydraulic systems, stone-cutting techniques, and what one clerk transcribed phonetically as something resembling energy keeper, a term with no equivalent in the English occupational lexicon of the 1870s. In Philadelphia, the earliest registries contain names that reference underground construction, subterranean maintenance, a vocabulary of infrastructure that doesn't map to any known trade guild of the colonial period. And the replacements follow the same logic everywhere. Names that referenced specialized knowledge were converted to names that referenced simple labor. The keeper of the arch becomes a carpenter. The warden of the canal becomes a waterman. The master of the foundation becomes a mason. The terminology of expertise is flattened into the terminology of trade. The language of a sophisticated civilization is compressed into the vocabulary of the one that replaced it. I want to be careful here because I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm not claiming that every Smith in the telephone directory is the descendant of a Tartarian infrastructure manager. I'm saying that the administrative process of surname standardization, the specific mechanics of how it was carried out, whom it was carried out upon, and what naming conventions it replaced, contains evidence of a transition that the official record doesn't adequately explain. Evidence of a previous organizational structure, a previous knowledge system, a previous way of understanding the relationship between a person and the built environment they maintained. The fires are worth mentioning. Because of course there were fires. In 1890, the United States Census Bureau reported that a fire had destroyed the vast majority of the 1890 census records, the most complete census ever conducted up to that point. The first to use mechanical tabulation, the first to capture granular demographic data at scale, was lost. Not partially, almost entirely. The official cause was a basement fire in the Commerce Building in Washington, D.C. in 1921, compounded by water damage and subsequent disposal of the damaged materials. But the 1890 census wasn't the only casualty. County courthouses across America experienced an extraordinary wave of fires throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s. Not all of them, of course. Fires were common in the era. Buildings burned, records perished. But the fires that consumed municipal records, specifically the records that predated surname standardization, the original ledgers, the pre-assignment registries, those fires cluster in a way that feels less like misfortune and more like pattern. The courthouse in Richland County, Ohio, burned in 1885. Records predating 1870 lost. The Sullivan County Courthouse in Tennessee burned in 1863. All early records destroyed. Courthouses in Missouri, in Georgia, in Virginia, in Kentucky, dozens of them, all experiencing catastrophic fires that selectively destroyed the oldest records. The records that would have contained the original names, the pre-standardized identities, the linguistic evidence of what came before. I am not saying someone went around setting fires in courthouses. I am saying that when you look at the distribution of these losses, at their timing, at what specifically was destroyed, the pattern does not look random. It looks like erasure, the same passive erasure I've documented in the architectural record, in the cartographic record, in the photographic record. Not active suppression, necessarily. Something quieter, something that works by allowing certain things to be lost, by not protecting what should have been protected, by letting entropy do the work that policy cannot openly perform. The deeper I went into the genealogical record, the more I encountered what professional researchers call the brick wall, the point in a family tree where the records simply end. For most American families, that wall sits somewhere between 1840 and 1870. Before that, the names change character. They become harder to trace. The indexing systems shift. The handwriting in the ledgers becomes less standardized, as if the clerks recording those earlier entries were working from a different template, in some cases, from a different conceptual framework entirely. Genealogists attribute this to the limitations of record-keeping in the pre-industrial era, and that's partially true. But it doesn't explain why the same wall appears at the same historical depth across different nations, different continents, different languages. It doesn't explain why the point of maximum genealogical opacity coincides so precisely with the period of Tartaria's disappearance from official cartography. It doesn't explain why, when you do manage to push past the wall, the names you find don't behave the way names are supposed to behave. They reference things that don't fit the standard occupational categories. They carry linguistic roots that don't belong to the languages supposedly spoken in those regions at those times. They suggest a world organized differently from the one we've been taught existed. I spoke with a genealogist in Prague, a woman who has spent 30 years tracing Central European family lines. She told me something that I haven't been able to shake. She said that in the oldest Czech and Moravian parish records, the ones that predate the Habsburg administrative reforms, she regularly encounters surnames that contain what she calls technical vocabulary. Not farming terms, not merchant terms, not the names of villages or rivers. Terms related to the maintenance of large-scale stone infrastructure. Terms that reference calibration, resonance, alignment. She said she showed a list of these terms to a colleague in historical linguistics who told her, politely but firmly, that the words didn't belong to any known Slavic dialect of the period. He suggested they were corruptions, miscopied from older documents. She asked him what older documents. He didn't have an answer. That conversation haunts me. Not because it proves anything. It doesn't. But because it reproduces, in miniature, the same pattern I've encountered everywhere in this research. Evidence that doesn't fit. A professional who notices. A question that gets asked. And then a deflection. A reclassification. A quiet filing away. Not suppression. Something gentler and more effective. The question simply ceases to be interesting. It stops being asked. And the evidence that prompted it returns to the archive, where it waits in the silence of a box that nobody opens. Consider what a name actually is, in its deepest function. Before it's a label, before it's a legal identifier, before it's a database entry, a name is a claim about belonging, about relationship, about what you are to the community you exist within. When a community calls someone Keeper of the Arch, that name carries information. It tells you what the community valued. It tells you what infrastructure they maintained. It tells you what knowledge they preserved. When a state replaces that name with Smith, that information is destroyed. Not the person. The person continues, lives, works, has children, dies. But the thread that connected them to a specific knowledge tradition, to a specific function within a specific civilization, that thread is cut. And within a generation, sometimes two, no one remembers it was ever there. That's not accident. That's architecture. The architecture of forgetting. And it raises a question I cannot put down. If you were inheriting a civilization you didn't build, if you were occupying structures whose engineering you couldn't replicate, if you were governing populations who remembered, however dimly, that the world used to work differently, what would you do first? You would rename them. You would give them names that made sense within your system, names that flattened their history into your categories, names that made them legible to your bureaucracy and invisible to their own past. You would standardize, register, assign. You would build vaults to store the new records and allow fires to consume the old ones. You would create a genealogical brick wall so consistent, so uniform, so global in its distribution that future researchers would assume it was simply the natural limit of record-keeping, rather than the engineered boundary it appears to be. And you would do it with paperwork, not with violence, not with armies, not with the dramatic machinery of conquest that leaves scars in the historical record, with clerks, with ledgers, with county directives and administrative orders, and the quiet authority of a man behind a desk who tells you that your name, the name your grandfather carried, the name that connected you to a function within a civilization you can no longer fully remember, is incompatible with the current framework. And here is your new one. Sign here. The violence of it is in the silence, in the way it doesn't look like violence at all, in the way it looks, to anyone examining it a century later, like mere administration, like paperwork, like the natural evolution of a modernizing society. And maybe that's the most effective form of erasure there is, not the kind that burns, the kind that files. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Across the same decades that Tartaria vanishes from the maps, the old names vanish from the ledgers. Across the same decades that the architectural record goes silent about who built the impossible structures, the naming record goes silent about what those people called themselves. The two erasures are not parallel. They are the same erasure, seen from different angles. I keep thinking about a phrase I found in one of the Ohio ledgers, written in the margin next to a name that had been crossed out and replaced. The clerk had written in a hand that suggested he was copying from instructions rather than composing his own thoughts. Previous designation incompatible with current administrative framework. Standard classification applied. Previous designation incompatible with current administrative framework. That's not the language of a county clerk in 1874. That's the language of a system that understood exactly what it was replacing and why. A system that recognized the old names as belonging to a different framework, a different organizational logic, a different civilization, and made the deliberate decision to overwrite them. I don't know what your surname was before it was your surname. I don't know what mine was. The records that would tell us were either replaced, or burned, or filed in basement vaults that no one visits, in ledgers that no one reads, in archives that are slowly, quietly, decaying into dust. But I know this: the buildings remember what the ledgers forgot. The architecture that accommodates different proportions, the infrastructure that implies different knowledge, the doorways and staircases and foundations built for a world that doesn't match the one we've been told existed, all of it carries the same message. Something was here before, something was organized differently, something was named differently. And the process of forgetting, the systematic, global, administratively coordinated process of forgetting, didn't start with the maps or the photographs or the skeletons. It started with the names. Because a name is the smallest unit of history. It's the thing a person carries when everything else has been taken. The house can burn. The records can be lost. The maps can be redrawn. But the name, if it survives, carries a thread back to whatever came before. And if you want the forgetting to be total, if you want the break to be clean, if you want a civilization to disappear so completely that its own descendants don't know it existed, you have to cut that thread. And someone did. Not everywhere at once. Not in a single dramatic act. Slowly, administratively, county by county, parish by parish, registry by registry, in the same quiet, methodical way that the maps were redrawn and the encyclopedias were edited and the photographs were filed away in archives marked miscellaneous. The silence that surrounds this isn't the absence of evidence. It's the evidence itself, the shape of what was removed, visible only in the outline it left behind, in the margins of old ledgers, in the brick walls of family trees, in the vaults of courthouses that were built. I'm increasingly convinced, not just to store records, but to control them. Your surname is a key, but the lock it was made for was changed a long time ago, and the door it once opened leads to a room that the current administrators would prefer you never knew existed. I don't have the answer to what's in that room. I have the shape of the question, and the deeper I go into the record, the more certain I become that the question itself is what they were trying to erase. Because once you ask it, once you look at your own name and wonder what it replaced, once you trace the administrative history of identity itself and find the same patterns, the same timing, the same coordinated silence that appears in the architecture, in the cartography, in the photographic record, you can't go back. You can't unsee it. You can't unfeel the weight of a name that isn't entirely yours, that was given to you by a system that needed you to forget where you came from. And the buildings still stand, and the vaults still hold what's left of the old ledgers. And somewhere in the margins, in a clerk's uncertain hand, the previous designation waits, incompatible with the current framework, but not gone, not entirely, not yet. What was your name before it was your name? And what would it tell you if you could hear it spoken in the language it was meant to be spoken in, about the world that existed before this one decided it never had? I think that question matters. I think it matters more than the people who replaced the names would like. And I think, if you're still here, if you've followed this thread to its end, you think so too. The next episode goes deeper into the administrative machinery itself, into the specific institutions that oversaw the transition, into the records that survived, despite the fires, despite the neglect, despite the quiet, patient architecture of forgetting. I wasn't sure I was ready to share what I found. I think I am now. See you there.